I want to tell 3 stories. Each one of these stories, I believe, helps us get a glimpse of ways that God's Spirit speaks to us. So the first story is a story, well, as you know, Susan and I and the kids were in Botswana for 6 years. But before we went, we had to decide whether or not we were going. And there's lots of bits to that deciding process. I mean, part of it is you fill out lots of forms and you send them to Winnipeg, and there's interviews and all sorts of things like that. But really what that does is decide, they determine whether or not you're qualified, or maybe even whether or not you're the best qualified that they have. But one of the things that was important for us to figure out was whether or not God wanted us there. So we worked at a number of ways of trying to listen to God's voice. But one way that I want to describe to you was this. We had a discernment meeting one night. We invited quite a number of different people who knew us from different angles to be there to help us listen to God's voice through God's Spirit. So one of the people who was there was Muriel Bechtel, who goes to Preston, that some of you may know. She was conference minister at that point, and so she knew us from that angle, from the conference perspective. We invited a whole bunch of our friends who happened to be pastors who knew us as peers, who had seen us as ministering people, and as we struggled with the issues that all of us were working with. And we invited some people, a couple people from Wilmot, who was the congregation that I was pastor of. And there were, I think, a few other folks there as well who knew us from different aspects of our life. And what we did is we took some time to describe, Susan and I took some time to describe 2 possible options that were in front of us. We had been in discussion, initial discussions with the congregation, but we weren't identifying the particulars there, but to say congregational ministry would be an option. And then we identified Botswana as a possibility, but again, trying to say, even if it's not Botswana, it might be something more like that. And we sort of presented those 2 possibilities out there and said, can you help us listen to God's Spirit around which one of those is the way to go? And then the people who were gathered there were sent off in the church. We were meeting at Wilmot, and it was an evening, and so the whole place was nice and quiet. And they went out, and they spent 3/4 of an hour trying to listen to what God's Spirit was saying to them. And that might be in a number of different ways. It might be through scripture passages that came up in their minds. It might be from a song or something else. It might be a word. It might be an image. And then we got together, and Susan and I were quiet, and it was our turn to listen, and the people who we'd invited were then able to describe what it was that they'd heard. Now, I've been part of a number of these sorts of meetings, and one of the things I find interesting is that often, not always, but often, what happens is a number of people will say something like this. I don't know if I got a clear message or not, but I got a feeling, or I got a bit of an idea that maybe this, whatever this is, it might be important. But they're not really sure. It's not like it was something blazing that was written in the sky above them. It was just sort of a feeling. But what is interesting oftentimes is as you go around the room with the people sharing, is that more and more people are sharing not exactly the same sorts of things, but a lot of things that seem to point in the same sort of direction. Well, that happened at our meeting as well. It was quite profound how that works. The little bits of uncertainty from a lot of people start pointing in a certain direction. There was also a person there who was trying to listen and said she wasn't hearing anything. So she said to God, look, I'm going to think of a number of situations that I could imagine Glenn and Susan in and ministering together in. And I want you to show me something about Glenn and Susan in those situations. So she imagined us as pastors in a congregation. She knew me in that context, and so that, us in that context, so that was an easy one for her to do. And she said that she could see us. Well, she could see our heads anyways. And she knew us fairly well, and she could imagine us in a number of different contexts, and so she, ministering contexts, and she imagined us in them, and she saw more or less of us in those various situations. And then she imagined us in Botswana, and she could see all of us and our kids. It became a very significant image for us as we continued the process of discerning. That wasn't the end of the process. It was an important step. And as we got to Botswana, and as in any new situation, things aren't always straightforward and easy. And so as we worked through some of that stuff, that image came back to us. A couple days later, one of our friends who had been at the meeting called me, and he said, "I'm convinced that within a year you'll be in Botswana." And within a year we were there. Within a year of that point, we were then in a village trying to survive the heat of October. The third story. Now, Mark started by talking about a story from the book of Acts, and Acts is a really tough book to just say, I'm just going to read this part, because it's all an incredible story. It feels to me when I start reading it like it's like a Indiana Jones movie. It just goes from one adventure to another, and that's one of the difficulties of trying to take out small sections. But I want to tell you a story from the book of Acts, when the church was very, very young and still trying to figure out what it means to be church. It comes from Acts chapter 10. And the story starts with a man called Cornelius who lived in Caesarea. Caesarea was a Roman town on the coast up in the northern part of Israel. And Cornelius was a centurion, which means that he was in charge of a whole bunch of soldiers, and he was from Italy. But he was also identified as a God-fearer. That is, he knew the faith of the Jewish people around him, and he recognized that this faith made more sense than any of the other worshiping of gods that he'd encountered in his life. And so he worshiped God, and he prayed to God, and he gave alms as required in the worshiping of God. But he was still a Gentile. He was still not a Jew. Well, we're told that one day, at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. And in this vision, the angel of the Lord came to him. And he was kind of excited about this and kind of frightened by this. And the angel assured him that things were okay, and that his prayers and his alms were seen by God, and that God wanted him to reach out and get a man called Simon Peter, from Joppa, to come and talk to him. So when he came out of his vision, he got 3 of his trusted servants and told them what had just happened and sent them to Joppa. Joppa is in much more of a central area. It's right part of current Tel Aviv. And he sent his servants there. Well, it's a fair journey by foot, and it takes over a day. And the next day, these servants were arriving at Joppa at about noon. And about the same time, Peter decided that he was going to go up on the roof of the building to pray. Now, here, most of our roofs are kind of pointy and are not good places to pray. Let me assure you, don't do it. Don't go there to pray. But in the Middle East, most roofs are flat. And they're great places to go to get away from the hustle and bustle of the family. And in the evenings, they're great places to go to get out of the heat of your building. But Peter went up at noon. And when he got up there and he started praying, he got really hungry. And so he sent for some food, and as he was waiting for the food to come back to him, he fell into a trance. And in that trance, he had a vision, and the vision was of like a picnic cloth coming out of heaven. And on the picnic cloth were all sorts of animals, 4-legged animals, reptiles, birds, all sorts of things. Now, in order to understand this parable, or the story, you have to understand that for the Jews, the world was divided into clean and unclean. And it worked with a number of different things, but particularly with food. There was clean food, that was the food you could eat, and unclean food, which you could not eat. And a lot of the animals that were described in this cloth were unclean. Peter heard a word, and the word said, take and kill and eat. And Peter said, whoa, no way! I have spent my whole life obeying the proper rules. I know the difference between clean and unclean, and I'm not going to eat something that's unclean. And then the voice of God said, what God has made clean, do not call unclean. And then the vision repeated itself 3 times. And then Peter came out of the trance, and he was really puzzled. He was sitting on the roof of the building trying to sort out what this was all about. And the men from Cornelius had arrived. They'd finally figured out which house was the one that Peter was staying at. And they were outside on the street yelling, Peter, is this the house of Simon Peter? Well, Peter was on the roof, but so deep in thought that he didn't hear them. Finally, God's Spirit had to interrupt him and say to him, there's some men downstairs. You better go greet them. But do it quickly and greet them well, because I have sent them to you. So he got up and went downstairs, and he said to them, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? And then they started explaining to them the vision that Cornelius had and their invitation for him to come with them back to Caesarea. Well, I said that Jews have divided up much of the world into clean and unclean, and it's true with food. It also was true with people. There were the clean people, that would be the Jews. And then there was the unclean people, that would be everybody else. And the Gentiles. And so clearly the people who were standing in front of the house there were Gentiles. And they did not associate with one another. Even if they lived close together, they did not associate with one another. They did not get together socially. They did not eat together. They did not enter one another's houses. There was no connections. Peter invited the 3 men inside, and they had supper, and they slept in the house. The next day, Peter went with the 3 men back to Caesarea with some other believers from Joppa. And the following day, again, it's a fair journey, the following day they finally arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius had gathered together all of his relatives and all of his friends to hear what Peter would say to them. So when Peter finally arrived at Cornelius' house, he greeted them, and he fell down and started worshiping Peter, at which point Peter said, no, I'm just a man, get up, we're both the same here. And then he went into the house and into the room where all the people had gathered. And Peter started by saying to them, you know that it's against the law for me to be here, but God has showed me that I cannot call anybody unclean. And then he said to Cornelius, so why is it that you have invited me here? And Cornelius talked again about the vision that he had had and what the Spirit had, or what the angel in the vision had said to him. And then he said to Peter, we're gathered here to hear the word that God has given to you to tell us. Mark's going to read that for us.
Peter fairly exploded with this good news. It's God's own truth. Nothing could be plainer. God plays no favorites. It makes no difference who you are or where you're from. If you want God and are ready to do as he says, the door is open. The message he sent to the children of Israel, that through Jesus Christ everything is being put together again, well, he's doing it everywhere, among everyone. You know the story of what happened in Judea. It began in Galilee after John preached a total life change. Then Jesus arrived from Nazareth, anointed by God with the Holy Spirit, ready for action. He went through the country helping people and healing everyone who was beaten down by the devil. He was able to do all this because God was with him. And we saw it. We saw it all. Everything he did in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, where they killed him, hung him on the cross. But in 3 days, God had him up, alive, and out where he could be seen. Not everyone saw him. He wasn't put on public display. Witnesses had been carefully handpicked by God beforehand. Us. We were the ones there to eat and drink with him after he came back from the dead. He commissioned us to announce this in public, to bear solemn witness that he is in fact the one who God destined as judge of the living and the dead. But we're not alone in this. Our witness that he is the means to forgiveness of sins is backed up by the witness of all the prophets.
And before Peter had even finished talking, God's Spirit had descended upon everybody who gathered there who had heard the word. And the believers from Joppa were absolutely amazed that God's Spirit had descended upon Gentiles in the same way that it had descended upon them earlier. And these Gentiles were speaking in tongues and worshiping God. And Peter looked around and went, if God's Spirit has descended upon them like this, how can we possibly deny baptism to them? And so he ordered them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, and he spent some days with them as well, teaching them and encouraging them. So, 3 stories about the way that God's Spirit has spoken to different people. I think sometimes we have the idea that when God's Spirit speaks, it's going to be loud and noisy and so obvious and so clear that it's completely unmistakable. Much more like Paul's journey to Damascus, where he was struck by lightning or by light and couldn't see, and from then on his whole life was changed. But my observation is that far more often when God speaks, it's through things that we actually could end up by ignoring. That it's small nudges. That sometimes we get lots of small nudges, and together it gets more and more obvious, but each one of those nudges, it's possible for us to ignore. And we need to be more tuned in and listening to those nudges. So, the story from the discernment meeting of Susan and I were part of. Each part of that we could have ignored. I mean, do you go out and change your life and move halfway across the world based on someone saying, well, I'm not sure about this, but maybe there was this little thing that I heard. Maybe, but I'm not sure. We wouldn't do that. It's really easy to ignore it. Now, clearly that night there was a lot of statements pointing in a very similar direction, and it gets harder and harder to ignore something when the nudges are all pointing in the same direction. But still. Or the vision of the woman that I described who saw us in different places. You know, I almost went into engineering. I really, really like things that are tangible and touchable and provable. And a story about seeing us, our heads, and part of our bodies, and then seeing all of us, that's not the sort of thing that most of us would sort of go, yep, okay, I'm ready to pack my bags now. It's the sort of thing that we could actually quite easily dismiss. And the particular person who said it, I really like and I really trust. That's why she was at that meeting, but she sometimes did have some interesting visions and interesting interpretations and stuff. And so it would have been quite easy to have brushed it off. And nobody at that meeting would have thought any the less of us if we'd said, you know what? I think really God's calling us to be in a church in Ontario. Or, I think I actually forgot to tell a story. I will tell the second story quickly. A week and a half ago, I was at a meeting. I don't know if anyone else... Yeah, were you at the MEDA meeting? Did you go to the MEDA? Yeah. I was at the MEDA meeting. MEDA is Mennonite Economic Development Associates. I keep on getting the last one wrong. It's an organization that works around the world, offices in North America, but also lots of regional groupings. And in May, they invite the pastors to show up at the one in St. Jacobs, the meeting at St. Jacobs. And so Richard Hackett invited me to go. And I went, and the speaker was Will Stoltz, who was one of my predecessors at Wilmot. And Will was described it. He had told a whole bunch of stories, but this one story I think is quite significant here. He told a story of traveling with a group of people. I think it was a media trip, but I'm not sure, but to do some work together in Russia. And it was a group of people with quite a different groups of skills. He's going as a chaplain at a correctional institution and a previous pastor, and there were other people with different skills. And they were in the Moscow airport, and they noticed a group of people there that seemed to have been there for a long time. In fact, these people seemed to have been there, well, they seemed to be living there. And Will was a bit curious. And he went up and started talking. Well, he noticed one of the women was reading a Bible, actually, and she went up and started talking with her and discovered, well, she said she had some questions about the Bible, so she started asking him when she discovered he was a pastor, and so they had a conversation about that. But then he said, so why are you here? What happened? And she said that she had been given a vision of how she could help her village in Nigeria. But in order to fulfill that vision, she needed some more skills and some training, and she discovered she could get that in Russia. And so she, along with some other people, were traveling to Russia to get that sort of training, and someone they were traveling with had stolen their passports and had gone through into Russia and sold the passports on the black market and got a whole bunch of money and had taken off. So there they were. They couldn't enter Russia because they didn't have passports. They couldn't get back to Nigeria because they didn't have passports. Even trying to eat was a little bit awkward in the Moscow airport. They had been there almost a year. And as they were talking, Will realized that one of the other people in their group had some significant contacts in places in the world. So they were talking about that as a group, and this other person had been involved in mediation. And in the course of his work in mediation, he had become well connected with some officials in Nigeria. And he knew that one of them that he knew well was actually stationed at the embassy in Moscow. So he contacted, afterwards they were able to contact it, make some connections, and the folks got traveling papers and what they needed, and they were also able to get the skills they needed in Russia after they got their papers, and were able to return to Nigeria and were able to do some of the things that they had seen that they could do for the villages. So what I think was important about that story is that, well, I've traveled. I don't know how many of you have been in airports, but when I go to an airport, I don't tend to talk to people. Or I talk to my family if my family's with me. But I've actually found airports are a great place to get some personal time. Because nobody there really cares to talk to you. You can sit and watch the planes, you can watch people, you can read a book. You can just spend some time alone, actually, even though there's people all around. I can only recall one significant conversation in an airport. Actually, it was an airplane, and it wasn't very significant. I got on an airplane, I was probably in my early 20s, and I sat down and I introduced myself to the person who was sitting beside me, and I gave her my name, and she said, "I'm Mrs. Cumming, Burton Cummings' mother." And I went, Burton Cummings, Burton Cummings, Burton Cummings. Oh, I've heard that name! Finally I went, "The guess who?" And she went and looked at me, sort of scowling, and went, "Yes," and didn't speak to me for the rest of the flight. That's how conversations with me have gone in most airports and most airplanes. I've had a lot of peace and quiet. But somehow, Will got curious, and there was this little nudge, which could have easily been ignored, but a little nudge that said, go find out more. Go talk to those people. I don't know if you've been in situations like that. Maybe I've had lots of those sort of nudges in airports, and I've just ignored them all. because those sort of nudges are really easy to ignore. But because he listened to that nudge, he engaged in the conversation and was able to make connections with the person in their group who had connection. And the whole thing was able to work out because he listened to that nudge that said, check out your curiosity. And Peter could have struggled and puzzled out that vision he had. He could have gone downstairs, received the men, and said to them, look, you're Gentiles. I'm a Jew. We don't mix. I just had a vision that confirmed everything that I know, that there's a difference between clean and unclean, and I'm clean and you can leave. He could have said it, and nobody would have said that he was wrong based on what they believed at the time. But he didn't. He paid attention carefully to what he'd seen in the vision, and he paid attention to what he'd heard and seen, and changed what he was going to do. Completely went against everything that he had been trained to do. In each one of these stories, there was a whole bunch of little nudges that could have been ignored, that they could have done something different. But God's Spirit was speaking, and they were listening to the nudges. The nudges which are so easy to ignore. In each of these stories, the people were all willing to be challenged. Maybe not jumping up and down and excited about it, but they were willing to accept a new sort of challenge. And part of that challenge was perhaps encountering new people, going to places where they would never have gone otherwise, maybe even understanding God and God's ways in a new way. In each of these stories, there's examples of how God is at work in ways that we would not anticipate. And in each of these stories, we talk sometimes about getting on board with what God's already doing. But it seems to me in these stories that it's almost more getting on board, in fact, running hard to get on board with what God's doing, because God's already so far out ahead. I mean, clearly, when we went to Botswana, we were not the carriers of the gospel. Even the very first Mennonites who went to Botswana, they were approached by churches that already existed there, asking for help. God was at work far before any Mennonites showed up in Botswana. Or with Will, clearly, the bits and pieces that were able to be put together in that airport were not just, it wasn't a fresh start right there, but God had already been at work making relationships and helping people meet people that could do things far before he showed up there. Or with Peter, clearly God had been at work for a long time with Cornelius. Peter's job wasn't to begin the journey, but was to help Cornelius along on one portion of the journey. So, the question for us right now is here at Wanner. How are we listening to the nudges that God is putting in our lives, whether it's collectively as a congregation or individually? How is God nudging us? And how are we paying attention to those nudges? How are we open to being challenged in new ways, to encounter new people or be in new places? How are we open to seeing God at work in new ways? How are we working, maybe running, at getting on board with what God is already doing here among us, here in the community around us in Haskell? Let's pray. Lord, you encourage us, you nudge us in all sorts of ways, in ways that oftentimes we find easy to ignore you, far easier to ignore than to follow the nudges. help us to listen to your nudging, to pay attention to you as you nudge us, to pay attention to your Spirit at work in our lives. And not merely to pay attention to you at work, but to act on it. To do what it is that you're nudging us to do. Help us to listen and respond to your Spirit at work in our lives. In Jesus' name.